Today we're going to read the first half of the short story, The Night Face Up, by Julio Cortázar. It starts on page 143. Remember, this story has two plots in it that run side by side. One with a modern character who is recovering from a motorcycle accident, and then possibly flashbacks to the past with a character facing human sacrifice far back in the past. So let's start at the top of 143, where it says in the middle there, it's hard to know what's real in this dreamlike story of a motorcyclist recuperating from an accident. And at certain periods, they went out to hunt enemies. They called it the War of the Blossom. Halfway down the long hotel vestibule, he thought that probably he was going to be late, and hurried on into the street to get out his motorcycle from the corner where the next-door superintendent let him keep it. On the jewelry store at the corner, he read that it was 10 to 9. He had time to spare. The sun filtered through the tall downtown buildings, and he, because for himself, for just going along thinking, he did not have a name, he swung onto the machine, savoring the idea of the ride. The motor whirred between his legs, and a cool wind whipped his pants legs. All right, we're turning to 144, starting with paragraph 2. He let the ministries zip past, the pink, the white, and a series of stores on the main street, their windows flashing. Now he was beginning the most pleasant part of the run, the real ride. A long street bordered with trees, very little traffic, with spacious villas whose gardens rambled all the way down to the sidewalks, which were barely indicated by low hedges. A bit inattentive, perhaps, but tooling along on the right side of the street, he allowed himself to be carried away by the freshness, by the weightless contraction of this hardly begun day. This involuntary relaxation, possibly, kept him from preventing the accident. When he saw that the woman standing on the corner had rushed into the crosswalk while he still had the green light, it was already somewhat too late for the simple solution. He braked hard with foot and hand. Wrenching himself to the left, he heard the woman scream, and at the collision, his vision went. It was like falling asleep all at once. He came to abruptly. 4 or 5 young men were getting him out from under the cycle. He felt the taste of salt and blood. One knee hurt, and when they hoisted him up, he yelped. He couldn't bear the pressure on his right arm. Voices, which did not seem to belong to the faces hanging above him, encouraged him cheerfully, with jokes and assurances. His single solace was to hear someone else confirm that the lights indeed had been in his favor. He asked about the woman, trying to keep down the nausea which was edging up into his throat. While they carried him face up to a nearby pharmacy, he learned that the cause of the accident had gotten only a few scrapes on the legs. Nah, you barely got her at all. But when you hit, the impact made the machine jump and flop on its side. Opinions, recollections of other smash-ups. Take it easy. Work him in the shoulders first. There, that's fine. And someone in a dust coat giving him a swallow of something soothing in the shadowy interior of the small local pharmacy. Paragraph 4. Within 5 minutes, the police ambulance arrived, and they lifted him onto a cushioned stretcher. It was a relief for him to be able to lie out flat, completely lucid, but realizing that he was suffering the effects of a terrible shock. He gave his information to the officer riding in the ambulance with him. The arm almost didn't hurt. Blood dripped down from a cut over his eyebrow all over his face. He licked his lips once or twice to drink it. He felt pretty good. It had been an accident. Tough luck. Stay quiet a few weeks, nothing worse. The guard said the motorcycle didn't seem badly racked up. Why should it, he replied. It all landed on top of me. They both laughed, and when they got to the hospital, the guard shook his hand and wished him luck. Now the nausea was coming back little by little. Meanwhile, they were pushing him on a wheeled stretcher toward a pavilion further back. Rolling along under trees full of birds, he shut his eyes and wished he were asleep or chloroformed. But they kept him for a good while in a room with the hospital smell, filling out a form, getting his clothes off, and dressing him in a stiff grayish smock. They moved his arm carefully. It didn't hurt him. The nurses were constantly making wisecracks, and if it hadn't been for the stomach contractions, he would have felt fine, almost happy. All right, we're on page 145 now, paragraph 5. They got him over to x-ray, and 20 minutes later, with the still damp negative lying on his chest like a black tombstone, they pushed him into surgery. Someone tall and thin in white came over and began to look at the x-rays. A woman's hands were arranging his head. He felt that they were moving him from one stretcher to another. The man in white came over to him again, smiling. Something gleamed in his right hand. He patted his cheek and made a sign to someone stationed behind. It was unusual as a dream because it was full of smells, and he never dreamt smells. First, a marshy smell. There to the left of the trail, the swamps began already, the quaking bogs from which no one ever returned. But the reek lifted, and instead there came a dark, fresh composite fragrance, like the night under which he moved, in flight from the Aztecs. And it was also natural. He had to run from the Aztecs who had set out on their manhunt, and his sole chance was to find a place to hide in the deepest part of the forest, taking care not to lose the narrow trail which only they, the Motecas, knew. What tormented him the most was the odor, as though notwithstanding the absolute acceptance of the dream, there was something which resisted that which was not habitual, which until that point had not participated in the game. It smells of war, he thought, his hand going instinctively to the stone knife, which was tucked at an angle into his girdle of woven wool. An unexpected sound made him crouch suddenly stock still and shaking. To be afraid was nothing strange. There was plenty of fear in his dreams. He waited, covered by the branches of a shrub and the starless night. Far off, probably on the other side of the big lake, they'd be lighting the bivouac fires. That part of the sky had a reddish glare. All right, let's turn back to page 145. If you could put a mark on paragraph 6. Up until paragraph 6, we have all the details about his motorcycle crash and getting to the hospital and talking to the nurses and going into surgery. And at the beginning of paragraph 6 is when things start to change. And I just want you to mark paragraph 6 so that when you're looking at questions later, you know where to go back to. That's the beginning of the only second plot. All right, so flip back to 146, and we're picking up right at the top. The sound was not repeated. It had been like a broken limb. Maybe an animal that, like himself, was escaping from the smell of war. He stood erect, slowly, sniffing the air. Not a sound could be heard, but the fear was still following, as was the smell, that cloying incense of the war of the blossom. He had to press forward, to stay out of the bogs and get to the heart of the forest. Groping uncertainly through the dark, stooping every other moment to touch the packed earth of the trail, he took a few steps. He would have liked to have broken into a run, but the gurgling fens lapped on either side of him. On the path and in the darkness, he took his bearings. Then he caught a horrible blast of that foul smell he was most afraid of and leaped forward desperately. "You're going to fall off the bed," said the patient next to him. "Stop bouncing around, old buddy." All right, so put a mark next to paragraph 8 because we are shifting again from him running through the night in a forest and swamps to somebody telling him that you're going to fall off your hospital bed. So we're shifting back again to that first plot. So put some kind of mark or circle or something near paragraph 8. All right, so paragraph 9. He opened his eyes and it was afternoon, the sun already low in the oversized windows of the long ward. While trying to smile at his neighbor, he detached himself almost physically from the final scene of the nightmare. His arm, in a plaster cast, hung suspended from an apparatus with weights and pulleys. He felt thirsty, as though he'd been running for miles, but they didn't want him to give him much water, barely enough to moisten his lips and make a mouthful. The fever was winning slowly, and he would have been able to sleep again, but he was enjoying the pleasure of keeping awake, eyes half closed, listening to the other patient's conversation, answering a question from time to time. He saw a little white pushcart come up beside the bed. A blonde nurse rubbed the front of his thigh with alcohol and stuck him with a fat needle connected to a tube which ran up to a bottle filled with a milky opalescent liquid. A young intern arrived with some metal and leather apparatus which he adjusted to fit onto the good arm to check something or other. Night fell, and the fever went along, dragging him down softly to a state in which things seemed embossed as though through opera glasses. They were real and soft, and at the time, vaguely distasteful, like sitting in a boring movie and thinking that, well, still, it'd be worse out in the street and staying. Paragraph 10. A cup of a marvelous golden broth came, smelling of leek, celery, and parsley. A small hunk of bread, more precious than a whole banquet, found itself crumbling little by little. His arm hardly hurt him at all, and only in the eyebrow where they'd taken stitches, a quick hot pain sizzled occasionally. When the big windows across the way turned to smudges of dark blue, he thought it would not be difficult for him to sleep. Still on his back, so a little uncomfortable, running his tongue out over his hot, too dry lips, he tasted the broth still, and with a sigh of bliss, he let himself drift off. All right, let's turn over to page 147, paragraph 11 at the top. First there was a confusion, as of one drawing all his sensations, for that moment blunted or muddled, into himself. He realized that he was running in pitch darkness. All right, so we probably want to mark paragraph 11 because he's falling asleep in the hospital, but now all of a sudden he's running in pitch darkness. So I think we might be back in the jungle. All right, so let's pick up 3 lines into paragraph 11. Pitch darkness, although above the sky crisscrossed with treetops, was less black than the rest. The trail, he thought. I've gotten off the trail. His feet sank into a bed of leaves and mud, and then he couldn't take a step that the branches of shrubs did not whiplash against his ribs and legs. Out of breath, knowing despite the darkness and silence that he was surrounded, he crouched down to listen. Maybe the trail was very near. With the first daylight, he would be able to see it again. Nothing now could help him to find it. The hand that had unconsciously gripped the haft of the dagger climbed like a fenned scorpion up to his neck, where the protecting amulet hung. Barely moving his lips, he mumbled the supplication of corn, which brings about the beneficent moons, and the prayer to her very highness, to the distributor of all Modican possessions. At the same time, he felt his ankles sinking deeper into the mud, and the waiting in the darkness of the obscure grove of live oak grew intolerable to him. The War of the Blossom had started at the beginning of the moon and had been going on for 3 days and 3 nights now. If he managed to hide in the depths of the forest, getting off the trail further up past the marsh country, perhaps the warriors wouldn't follow his track. He thought of the many prisoners they'd already taken, but the number didn't count, only the consecrated period. The hunt would continue until the priest gave the sign to return. Everything had its number and its limit, and it was within the sacred period, and he on the other side from the hunters. He heard the cries and leaped up, knife in hand. As if the sky were aflame on the horizon, he saw torches moving among the branches very near him. The smell of war was unbearable, and when the first enemy jumped him, leaped at his throat, he felt an almost pleasure in sinking the stone blade flat to the haft into his chest. The lights were already around him, the happy cries. He managed to cut the air once or twice, then a rope snared him from behind. "It's the fever," the man in the next bed said. Oh, they're talking about a bed. So, paragraph 13, we're back in the hospital after the motorcycle accident. So, mark paragraph 13. "It's the fever," the man in the next bed said. "The same thing happened to me when they operated on my duodenum." I might have pronounced that wrong. "Take some water, you'll see. You'll sleep all right." Laid next to the night from which he came back, the tepid shadow of the ward seemed delicious to him. A violet lamp kept watch high on the far wall like a guardian eye. You could hear coughing, deep breathing, once in a while a conversation in whispers. Everything was pleasant and secure without the chase. No, but he didn't want to go on thinking about the nightmare. There were lots of things to amuse himself with. He began to look at the cast on his arm and the pulleys that held it so comfortably in the air. They'd left a bottle of mineral water on the night table beside him. He put the neck of the bottle to his mouth and drank it like a precious liqueur. All right, we're going to stop for today and start looking at questions on your worksheet. So we'll end the recording.